Hello and welcome. Today I'd like to invite you to join me in thinking about a series of poems from George MacDonald's A Book of Strife in the form of the Diary of an Old Soul. In this work, MacDonald wrote a 7-line poem, a half sonnet so to speak, for every single day of the year. The sequence that I'd like to think about with you is from December, specifically December 14th through 21st. So if you have a copy of the diary, you can follow along with me. I'm going to begin by simply reciting them from the 14th to the 21st. I'm not going to mark heavily the divisions between the poems because they really do make a whole, but I am going to begin with December 14th. This is not life, this being is not enough, but thou art life, and thou hast life for me. Thou madest the worm, to cast the wormy slough, and fly abroad, a glory flit and flee. Thou hast me statue-like hewn in the rough, meaning at length to shape me perfectly. Lord, thou hast called me forth, I turn and call on thee. 'Tis thine to make, mine to rejoice in thine. As hungering for its mother's face and eyes, the child flings wide the door, back to the wall, I rush to thee, the refuge from poor lies. Lean dogs behind me whimper, yelp, and whine. Life lieth ever sick, death's writhing thrall, in slavery endless, hopeless, and supine. The life that hath not willed itself to be must clasp the life that willed and be at peace, or like a leaf wind-blown through chaos flee, a life-husk into which the demons go, and work their will and drive it to and fro, a thing that neither is nor yet can cease, which uncreation can alone release. But when I turn and grasp the making hand, and will the making will with confidence, I ride the crest of the creation wave, helpless no more existence slave. In the heart of love's creating fire I stand, and God possessed in heart and soul and sense, take up the making share the making Master gave. That man alone who does the Father's works can be the Father's Son, yea, only he, who Son-like can create, can ever be. Who with God wills not, is no son, not free. O Father, send the demon doubt that lurks behind the hope out into the abyss. Who trusts in knowledge all its good shall miss. Thy beasts are sinless and do live before thee. Thy child is sinful and must run to thee. Thy angels sin not and in peace adore thee. But I must will or never more be free. I from thy heart came, how can I ignore thee? Back to thy presence I hurry, haste, and flee. There I shall dwell, love praising evermore thee. My holy self, thy pure ideal lies, calm in thy bosom which it cannot leave. Myself unholy, no ideal, hies hither and thither, gathering store to grieve. Not now, O Father, now it mounts, it flies, to join the true self in thy heart that waits, and one with it be one with all the heavenly mates. Trusting thee, Christ, I kneel and clasp thy knee, cast myself down and kiss thy brother feet. One self thou, and the Father's thought of thee. Ideal Son, thou hast left the perfect home. Ideal Brother, to seek thy brothers come. Thou know'st their angels all, God's children sweet, and of each two will make one holy child complete. This series of 8 poems is a really good encapsulation of all of MacDonald's thought and theology, and we could compare it with what he wrote in all his novels, fantasy works, and sermons. But in particular, I'd like to consider this in the light of 2 works that he wrote after the diary. The Unspoken Sermons, which came after the diary, at least the last 2 series, and Lilith, his late masterwork and adult fairy tale. Let's begin back with December 14th. And now we're going to go deeper and look line by line. This is not life. This being is not enough. This has really strong resonances with, well, the rest of the Diary of an Old Soul, for one thing, where MacDonald is dealing with this. I need more life. The cry of the creature is for more life. And in his magnificent sermon, Life, in Unspoken Sermon Series 2, he explores this in great power and depth. And he says, we are vessels of life, not yet full of the wine of life, and where the wine doesn't reach, the clay vessel cracks and is distressed. But the answer is not to pour out the wine that's there, right? The answer is not death. The answer is more life, to fill it up to the brim. And this is what he cries for in the Unspoken Sermons and in the diary. This also has strong resonances with the central plot and conflict in Lilith, specifically with Mr. Vane's story. And Mr. Raven's challenge to Mr. Vane in the story is, you think you're alive, but your life is not sufficient in itself. This isn't life. He says, Mr. Vane objects to lying down in the house of Adam and Eve and sleeping the sleep of death. And he says, these people are dead, but I'm alive. And Mr. Raven says, not much. Blessed is the life, that's not death, that is so essential that it has nothing to do with death. He says, you're not yet fully alive, not alive like you need to be. And this is the central conflict as we enter this poem, December 14th. This is not life. This being is not enough. But he immediately counters it with the positive. But thou art life, and thou hast life for me. There is life to be found. We can be immersed in our source, in whom our life is. We can be one with our source, the one, the being, the person who is our life. And MacDonald constantly says this in the diary, but we need to go back home. We need to bring our beings back home to the person from which our life issued and in which is the source and spring of our life. And so, but thou art life, and thou hast life for me. Thou madest the worm to cast the wormy slough, and fly abroad, a glory flit and flee. Now this sounds definitely like the classic metaphor of caterpillar, chrysalis, butterfly, and I think it's meant to. It's interesting that he uses the word worm. You could say, okay, well, poetically, he didn't have enough room for caterpillar, didn't fit the rhyme or the rhythm, so he used the word worm, and that may very well be. But there's a very interesting passage in Lilith where Mr. Vane sees Mr. Raven as a raven on the wet soil after a thunder shower, literally picking up worms, but instead of eating them, throwing them into the air when they grow wings and fly into the sky, where they appear as clouds with brilliant colors. And Mr. Vane is flabbergasted. He says, you can't do that. For one thing, earthworms are not the larvae of caterpillars. For another thing, is it your job to make these lowly worms into this exalted creature? And he says something which he later realizes is completely foolish. He says, aren't they just going to become arrogant and forget their humble origins if you do that to them? And Raven counters and says, this is my job. This is the job of a sexton, the person who watches the churchyard. And in Lilith, Mr. Raven is also has many interlocked identities. And he's also the sexton of a great churchyard. But his job is not to just sit by and, bury the dead and just sit by. His job is to watch for their resurrection. And he says, this is a good image of the job of a sexton, to take that worm, throw it up into the air. Thou madest the worm to cast the wormy slough, and fly abroad a glory flit and flee. Fascinating resonances with what he later wrote in Lilith. Thou hast me statue-like, hewn in the rough, meaning at length to shape me perfectly. Another metaphor of calling forth from the rough-hewn form. A metaphor that he uses not so much specifically in Lilith, but in Phantastes, the almost parallel fairy tale that he wrote at the very beginning of his writing career. And also coming of age development story, also wrestling with the problem of self and dealing with one's shadow or false self and becoming one's true self. So he deals with that image more in Phantastes. But again, there's the congruence between God's eternal idea of us and the need for us to actually become that idea in time. But this is not through our effort, our huffing and puffing, although our will is energetically involved to the highest of our capacities in this process, but through God's work, his shaping, right? We are receiving his shaping really through everything that happens to us in our lives. Thou hast me statue-like, hewn in the rough, meaning at length to shape me perfectly. Lord, thou hast called me forth, I turn and call on thee. Lord, thou hast called me forth, I turn and call on thee. This is a wonderful concluding couplet. It is the essence, I think, of a life of a selfhood that is grounded, that a human being becomes aware that they weren't just made by God and left there to conduct their life the best they know how, but we are presently called forth from God. We are right now because God is speaking us. We are dynamically and presently related to our Creator in that we are because he calls us forth. Not just that he has called us forth, we issue from him dynamically. He has called us forth so that we can turn and call on him, bring our beings back to the source, complete the life circle, as MacDonald says it in his great sermon, Life. He's called us forth so we can turn and call on him, and when we do that, we complete the circle. We were brought forth from his heart, not just fashioned with his hands, but brought forth from his heart, separated from him far enough so that we could have individual existence, being, and will, but so then we could turn, see him, regard him, call on him, bring our being voluntarily back to its source. And this is the essence of MacDonald's theology. And you can almost think of his sermons, Life and the Creation of Christ, like two of Paul's great letters, like Romans and Galatians, or Ephesians and Colossians, two great parallel statements of the essence of his theology. And I'm not saying, obviously there would be no, unspoken sermons were it not for the were it not for the New Testament. So, he's coming after and owing everything, to the New Testament. But these sermons, Life and the Creation of Christ, are these two great parallel summaries in many ways of his understanding of being and how our beings join Christ and how Christ lives to the Father. Okay, so that was December 14th, and we've taken that in pretty great detail. So I'll probably need to split this ultimately into more than one video. But let's go ahead and dive into December 15th now. "'Tis thine to make, mine to rejoice in thine. 'Tis thine to make, mine to rejoice in thine." And I love this because this gives our part, God's part, in a way that I feel is so freeing and so restful. Right? We have a part. It exercises the full strength of our will, and yet it is restful and peaceful. It is thine to make. You're the one who has called us forth, who has shaped me in the rough and is shaping right now. It's it's my part to rejoice in your part, to delight in this being shaped, to receive with gratitude and thanksgiving every shaping circumstance, which is every circumstance, that you bring to me, voluntarily and actively yield myself to be shaped by it, by receiving it with thanksgiving. So it's your part to shape. My being is in your hands. You made me. You know what you're doing. You're surely and reliably bringing me to where I need to be. It's my part to rejoice in your part. And this takes me back to what I've been thinking about and writing about with Lilith, because this is the lesson that Mr. Vane has to learn through the story, in which it takes him so long to learn. When he becomes aware that it's his responsibility to live and to do good, and to justify his existence and to benefit his brothers and sisters, he receives that responsibility, but he goes off on his own to try to fulfill it. Driven by that sense of responsibility, he doesn't listen to the instructions, because the instructions which were given him were to come home, to rest. Adam and Eve tell him, the day begins with rest. You can do nothing except you sleep first. First receive the rest. Then you'll be able to do. And in Lilith, Adam, who is Mr. Raven, addresses this preoccupation that we have with doing, and this overvalue that we have on accomplishment. He says, men think so much of having done that they positively fall asleep upon it. They can't empty an egg, but they turn into the shell and lie down. And this great and almost horrifying idea of, you're sitting down at breakfast and you're eating your soft-boiled egg, and you take your spoon and you knock the top off, and you scoop out the egg and you eat it, and you're so proud of your accomplishment that you just curl up in the shell of the egg and go to sleep, in a sense that, wow, I did it, right? And we so dote on having done, having accomplished. And we do this even if we're following a supposed gospel of grace, right? And this really gives the lie to it by saying our part is to be shaped. It's not a passive part. but it's an active receiving of the shaping and a yielding to the shaping. And every thing that comes to it in our lives is a part of that shaping. And this is really well borne out by that idea of sleep in Lilith. And because in sleep, we have to yield ourselves to whatever experience is going to come to us. We're not in control of what's going to come to us through our dreams. We just have to open up to whatever experience is going to come to us in our sleep. And MacDonald uses that of the metaphor of regaining childhood, regaining childlikeness, regaining innocence. Because it's through the things that God brings to us that he can wipe away the stains and damage on our being that came from living in this unchildlike assumption of responsibility over our lives. And the wounds that we received through that, and the weary, suspicious, avaricious old self that we've developed through living that way. And he can sponge away those wounds and restore us to a divine childhood through those. And literally in Lilith, it's through the dreams that come. When we yield ourselves and give ourselves up to the night. And this has really strong resonances also with Novalis' Hymns to the Night. Novalis was a German philosopher and poet that MacDonald loved and translated. And there's strong echoes of Novalis' Hymns to the Night in Lilith. I think it's one of the greatest influences on Lilith outside of Dante's Divine Comedy and the Gospel of John, and also some of his just prior works and thoughts in his own life. So this idea of sleep is this: my part is to rejoice in your part, and I will receive and welcome every experience you give to me, because that is what is shaping me. My being is in your hands. Okay? All right, so 'tis thine to make, mine to rejoice in thine. As hungering for its mother's face and eyes, the child flings wide the door back to the wall. I rush to thee, the refuge from poor lies. I rush to thee, the refuge from poor lies. I love this. This is the picture of MacDonald's idea of living like a child. Running upstairs to your parents' room, flinging the door wide, banging it against the door, running to them, flinging yourself into their arms pouring out all your troubles, right? You got hurt. You're in distress. You got dirty. You don't try to fix it on your own. You run home. And your home is in your mother's arms, is in your father's arms. George MacDonald, in many of his fantasy works, represents God through the divine figure as a mother, and he beautifully represents the motherhood of God. Other times in his novels and his sermons, he represents the fatherhood of God. Either way, our home is in the arms of the person who gave us being. Right? And so this wonderful idea of running home, that's how we ground our beings. And as I've been writing about Lilith, I've been writing about it in the context of Søren Kierkegaard's great philosophical work, The Sickness Unto Death. Not that I think that there was a direct influence on Lilith. I have no evidence that MacDonald read that book, but because it gives such a wonderful framework to describe what MacDonald is talking about about selfhood. Because in The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard talks about a dynamic groundedness, that what we need is a grounded self, and we can dynamically ground ourself in the power that established it. And that is our only freedom from despair. Despair is this not enough life, this gnawing, this consumption of lack of life, not being who we want to be, being who we don't want to be, not being able to get out of that. But that freedom of despair is to bring our being home and to ground it in our source. So MacDonald, in his sermon, The Child in the Midst, where he discusses childlikeness, and he discusses the idea that God is childlike, God is a child. And so we need to become like children because we need to become like God. And that childlikeness is not just this arbitrary set of character traits, but childlikeness is a way of life that is God's way of life. And he says, of course, a child can be childlike or not childlike. That many children, have had that spoiled from a very early age by having to look out for themselves and not being cared for. But we can regain that divine childlikeness. And we can learn how to just not be afraid to fling God's presence chamber, the door, back to the wall, not worry about bothering him, not worry about inconvenience him, but rush to him. That's just a very literal image of how we bring our beings home. Okay, this is our refuge from poor lies. We can think of being hunted or haunted with despair. Those lean dogs behind us whimper, yelp, and whine. Life lieth ever sick, death's writhing thrall, in slavery, endless, hopeless, and supine. So many resonances here with Lilith and the figures of death in life and despair. So many living death images in Lilith of skeletons and monsters and Lilith herself, death in life and life in death. And how do we get free from that? From death, from that gnawing and consuming. But it's meant to hunt us home to God. These are the hounds of heaven. This death, this despair, this distress, meant to hunt us back to the Father, back to our home. And if we use it that way, then everything becomes God's shaping of us. Okay, so that was just December 14th and 15th. And this would be a good place to pause and pick up in the next video with December 16th and onwards. Thank you.